an all-new episode.
No politics.
No one is talking about this.
More than 80,000 Americans missing from our previous conflicts going back to World War II.
80,000 missing Americans?
These great species are never going to come back again.
Extinction is forever.
The trajectory that the United States is on right now as it relates to violence is not a good one.
87.9% of men on OnlyFans are married.
No politics.
No politics, let's do it! So what makes red wolves so different from other wolves?
Sure. Well, red wolves are really interesting is that they are, as a species, are completely unique to the United States. So other canids, other wolf species like gray wolves, they actually range across the globe, whereas red wolves evolved and adapted here in the southeastern United States. Uniquely in North America. So that makes them quite special. And they are interesting also in the types of habitats they use and also in their family dynamics. So they once ranged across a vast stretch of the United States, essentially from East Texas all the way up to part of the Northeast, like New Jersey and Southern New York, and all the states in between down through Florida. So you can imagine with that huge swath of habitat, they're highly adapted to take advantage of forest, wetlands, open grasslands, and savanna type habitats as well. And their principal prey is white-tailed deer, but they're also really prolific rodent hunters, and they play a very unique and special role in local ecology, in that they help to sort of keep prey populations in check, which helps reduce and minimize disease. It also helps reduce and minimize things like crop damage, which is important for farming and human interests as well. And I mentioned their family dynamics. Also unique, a lot of folks have this sort of classic image of wolf packs, being in the 10s and 20, a couple dozen animals all together, these multi sort of family groups in one large pack. And that's absolutely the case for Western wolves and gray wolves, generally because they're taking down much larger prey. And so they've got to, sort of put on the hunt in a different dynamic. Whereas red wolves, their family groups are much like our own, in that it's generally just a breeding pair. The young that they produced the prior year, so yearlings, and then whatever pups they're able to have each year. And so you've got sort of this rotating family group of breeding animals and their offspring, and the generation of offspring help to take care of the next generation before they then move on to establish new territories as well. So sort of small, intimate family groups that work together. And again, used to be able to do this all across the Southeast. Unfortunately, now, another thing that makes them very unique is that they are the most endangered canine in the world. And they're only found on an area called the Albemarle Peninsula, which is in far eastern North Carolina, in a red wolf recovery area there. Makes up about 5 counties, a few million acres. And that's the only place in the world that this animal is found in the wild.
Wow, so they went up from all the way up to like New Jersey, up north, to where the climate actually gets a little bit warmer down south. What exactly happened then to where now they're just like cornered in this little section in North Carolina? Of
course. Well, it's not a unique story for the red wolf. Most predators, whether it was puma, wolves, anything that colonists and folks that came to the U.S. in those early centuries saw as competition or a threat, they were eradicated. And eradicated wholesale. There were actually bounties put out. There were, these sort of massive hunts and sort of lethal killing campaigns. And so, people essentially just wiped them out all across their range, which, is pretty incredible. And that's also, over time, we wiped out other populations of species. We had no concept of what impacts we were having on the populations. And so red wolves began to dwindle. They also began to lose a lot of habitat as, widespread logging and industrialization and development. So they really just kept taking hit after hit after hit, to the point where in sort of the 1950s and 60s, scientists and wildlife biologists began to become very concerned about this very unique species. At that time, really could only be located in kind of these deep swamplands of Southwest Louisiana and in southeastern Texas. And people started to worry about losing the species. And so at that same time, sort of the environmental ethos shifted in the United States. And we started to see federal legislation and law passed, such as the predecessor and then eventually the Endangered Species Act in the early 70s. And that was really kind of a clarion call to recognize and understand that we as human beings have a responsibility and a real need to ensure that we are not driving species to extinction. The cliche, and it's very true, is extinction is forever. And when you lose any species, it has dramatic effects all through the food web, all through local ecology. And those effects are even more severe in what we call these highly interactive species. So your top level predators, they have real, top down regulation effects on the rest of the food web. So taking that critical piece out really just disassembles the whole system. So anyway, long way of saying that with big concern, political will, and the recognition that we had to act, moved the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to take very, very bold action, and essentially in the 60s and 70s went out and captured every canine they could find in Louisiana, Texas, bring them into captivity. At that time, we didn't have DNA and much understanding of genetics, and so at that time it was sort of what animal resembles the sort of our understanding of a red wolf, and so they culled those animals down to essentially about 14 what we call founders. So they took 14 red wolves from the wild, moved them into captivity, and started a captive breeding program, actually the first of its kind for any large mammal. And then after another decade or so, as they rebuilt that population, as they got these animals breeding and their numbers up in captivity, they started to look for a place to re-release and reintroduce animals back to their native range. That was also a first for us in the U.S. and for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so serendipitously about that time, there was a big land sale in eastern North Carolina to the federal government. So we established national wildlife refuges, which are managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the purpose of recovering wildlife species. And so we had this vast area. And again, it was a peninsula. So it's kind of guarded on three sides by water. Now, wolves do swim, but they can't cover huge distances. Anyway, they decided, because what was interesting at the time, they really didn't understand a lot about red wolf ecology. Again, we had decimated the species to the brink of extinction. We were afraid of losing them. We took bold steps. And so at that time, it was just kind of some, informed, but sometimes, just some guesses and some risk. So at that time, the agency was quite bold in their action, and they actually introduced in 1987 several wolves on the landscape. And then from that point forward, once they sort of, it's funny because, animals teach us a lot about what we need to know about them. And so at the early stages, we understood their behavior. We started to see this is the type of habitat they like. This is the kind of prey they need. And we got onto a cycle of continuing to build up populations in captivity and reintroducing wolves on the ground. So from about 1987 all the way up to the early 2000s, we brought the population from, fewer than 8 animals in the wild at the first reintroduction all the way up to nearly over 130 animals. And that was, again, at that time, celebrated as one of the most successful reintroductions of a large mammal ever. And it was really highly touted and celebrated. In fact, the Red Wolf program and the lessons learned through that captive breeding and reintroduction were the genesis for the gray wolf reintroduction to Yellowstone. So for all of those gray wolf fans out there, you have the Red Wolf program to thank for the success of that effort.
Yeah, you said they went down to 8 total?
Well, that was the initial amount of wolves released in 87.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So from there, each year they would put more wolves out. And from there, with breeding, with maintaining numbers by releases, the total population got up to nearly over 130, nearly 150 in the wild.
Okay, and where are we right now, in terms of number wise?
Yeah, so the Red Wolf program, from those days of success and celebration, unfortunately did take quite a negative turn. And there's a lot to unpack in the why, but to kind of come to the answer to your question quickly, we're currently, our total population in the wild is estimated between 17 and 20 animals. And we provide that range because it's impossible to, locate every single animal. These animals are very wily. They don't like to be around people. They don't like to be captured and tagged and whatever else. But so we typically use the term known animals. And so right now the population of known animals is around 17. And when we say known, what we're defining there is essentially these animals have radio and GPS tracking collars to allow Fish and Wildlife Service and biologists to help manage them, to understand where their movements are happening, where they're locating. And this is also part of a process, to help keep the public informed, particularly so we can help reduce any kind of conflict that may arise. Because, living with predators on the landscape, particularly predators that we wiped out, and there has been really no human memory of them existing for several generations, it's a bit of a switch that has to flip, and it takes time. And so a lot of what we focus on at Defenders is helping to ensure that we can reduce conflict, we can promote coexistence, we can promote tolerance, and really build up what we call the social carrying capacity. So in ecology, we use the term carrying capacity to connote how many individuals a system can support. Social carrying capacity sort of adds that human dimension to the equation. It says, well, sure, local ecology can support 200 wolves, but socially, we're only comfortable with this many. And that's a really interesting tension, and it's funny, because as a, trained biologist, I have been stunned in my career just how much more a lot of my work now is really sort of social science and psychology and working in communities and in conversation and just talking about values and sharing stories. So it's interesting. I mean, obviously science has a critically important role, but it's really interesting to me to sort of see us needing to make that necessary pivot to understand and meet people where they are, to have these critical conversations, because we have to do it together. I often tell folks, if you look at the root of any environmental problem, the answer is typically human behaviors. So therefore, the only sustainable solution, is to shift those same behaviors. So it's got to be human focused. And that's an interesting dynamic that we deal with.
Yeah, and I feel like that's where the Endangered Species Act comes in to try to, not necessarily kind of force people to kind of reconsider their actions and what they're doing as a last ditch effort to kind of keep the survival of some of these species. Now, what are some of the protections that the red wolf can receive by being listed as an endangered species?
Of course. Well, just quickly, you're absolutely right. The Endangered Species Act is an absolutely critical backstop to prevent extinction. It's one of our bedrock environmental laws. And in my mind, it's one of our most really interesting pieces of legislation, because for the first time, we defined the values of our nation beyond just our citizens, right? We defined it almost globally, and we recognize the role that other species have to play in our own lives and in the importance of maintaining the integrity of our country. So it was a very bold thing. But the ESA is it's simple in its what it outlines, but it's very complex in its implementation. So there's a lot of different categories, classifications, but I think most folks understand that through the act, what it does is it sets up a system to evaluate where species are at. And as species dwindle, we're looking at science, looking at data, we can see this species is in trouble. It's lost habitat, is threatened by pollution, by poaching, whatever it is. There's all these threats that exist. The big one now, of course, is climate change, which has really turned a lot of things on their head because it's so vast and difficult to control. So anyway, as those populations are monitored, if we start to, so there's two classifications. There's threatened and endangered. So a threatened species is at risk of becoming endangered. An endangered species is at risk of becoming extinct. Now, within those definitions, there is some latitude. So for example, with red wolves, anywhere they exist on federally owned public land, they're classified as endangered. Off of federal property, they are covered under a section of the law called Section 4D, which is really what covers what we call reintroduced species. And this was a very important mechanism in the law because what it allows for is for managers and wildlife biologists, those that know best what the species needs, it gives them the latitude and freedom to be hands-on and proactive in the conservation and management of these species, which sometimes can add risk. So essentially what it does is it provides a measure of some wiggle room for biologists to interact with these highly endangered at-risk species. So they're covered under a 4D rule, which sort of dictates how they're managed in the landscape. And so they're technically classified as threatened under that 4D rule, essentially because in very, very, very limited prescriptive purposes, they can't allow take. And that's sort of a nuance in the law. You know, we use terms like take, we use terms like harm. So for example, as a 4D species, let's say a red wolf, and again, this is a very rare instance, but it's just sort of an example, starts to nose around someone's chicken coop, for example. So the Fish and Wildlife Service can respond based on the status of the species to haze that animal away, to, you know, maybe even trap that animal and move it. If it was categorized as fully endangered with no latitude, it'd be hard for the Fish and Wildlife Service to take action, and it would be hard for them to help alleviate any kind of challenge that a landowner or someone was having. So it's good to have flexibility, particularly in a law that really commands us to do so much. And so providing that flexibility is something we certainly support. And so that's kind of how the status of the red wolf is taken into account. And that's important because, you know, when we start thinking beyond North Carolina, again, as I mentioned at the top, this is a species that had a vast range. You know, the goal of the recovery plan for red wolves is to have at least 3 self-sustaining populations established in its historic range. So we have 1. We're getting those numbers back up where they need to be. But now we're looking to see where else can these wolves go. And again, we can look and see like, okay, that's got great habitat. That's got a big federal land base. This has got, you know, good prey base. But then we have to factor in those social dynamics. Like, okay, well, we have a state government who's hostile to this kind of thing. We have people who are, you know, hell no way when it comes to predator introduction. So in order to tip the scales, we have to, again, have that flexibility under the Endangered Species Act to reintroduce more populations in places where they can sustain. So
I'm sure you got some thoughts from some farmers, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic. I've learned a lot of really fascinating. It's interesting. I'm happy to talk more about it.
No, I'm sure you got plenty on there. I know of that from just looking up some of the stories out in the ranches out west with the gray wolf in Yellowstone, their first introductions there, and also with some moose lovers from out there too, you know. And that's an interesting dynamic with people, which I think is really what, you know, causes that friction sometimes with some of the laws that are implemented. And so when, you know, the intent is really, you know, to protect the animal. And I can only imagine some of the frustration from people at times too. But so some of these animals, though, I mean, like you said, the numbers that are left as in the wild are so severe that it really is they're on life support, you know. And I think you know, a lot of these, instead of seeing them as like pure enemies, you know, that might help the awareness of the situation, where people might go, you know, okay, that might be hostile to, say, you know, my livestock or so forth. But I'm sure that there's, you know, methods and help that can be met with reporting that there is a red wolf that is critically endangered that keeps showing up around my property. Yeah. You know, is there anything that we can possibly do? Because I don't want to, you know, do something, because I've heard some horror stories of some endangered species. The white-tailed vulture out in Africa became so endangered, and it wasn't even pretty much because of farmers, and it wasn't even intended for them too. I mean, what would happen is they would a farmer would have their livestock eaten up by a lion. You know, the dead carcass would sit there, and the farmers would get tired of this. They'd shoo the lion away, douse poison all over the cattle or the dead carcass. Yeah, and then the vultures come in, and they're coming in the 10, 20, 30 birds in there, and start eating up, and it's poisonous, and then you're killing off, I mean, so many just in one little carcass. And then, you know, of course, you're threatening that species, and then you have carcasses all over the place that are filled with poison, and nobody can eat them. And white-backed vultures are the only, not the only, but, you know, one of the main species that is their duty is to eat up these bacteria.
As a scavenger, sure.
Yeah, exactly. And they can only process. I think their stomachs are about like 60 times the strength of a human's, which is why they can process that meat. So, you know, you get rid of them, man. Yeah, it's bad news. But it's interesting that kind of circle. So with that small amount of numbers of red wolves back into the wild, because it really is a tiny number, and they're kind of all in this nook in one space. Is there any concern about inbreeding and the negative effects of it?
Absolutely, and that's something that absolutely we work to prevent. And interestingly enough, wolves do a pretty good job of avoiding it. But I want to mention, we talk about the wild population, but that captive population, we're now upwards of 245 animals. Probably hovering close to 50 different private and publicly funded facilities across the country that support the Red Wolf program. They are part of the Save Animals from Extinction program of the Association of Zoos and Aquaria, which is the SAFE program. So red wolves are, there's a cooperative program through the SAFE program to bring all these facilities together to talk about, husbandry, how we're rearing these animals in captivity. For example, the animals that are, every animal that's in captivity, with some exceptions, have to be managed to be ready to be released, which means they have no human contact or very little. They generally get sometimes, supplemented with a wild diet, and also there's a lot of techniques, tools, and resources that folks in the zoological world really do take to heart and do a great job of it. They also, we have some pretty powerful tools for understanding genetics as well. And so it's really fascinating. So the SAFE program, I've been able to be a part of that effort for many years now. We meet annually, and one of the more exciting things we do is called Matchmaking Day. And we essentially have all these butcher paper, up on the wall, and Post-it notes, pink ones for the women or for the females and blue for the males. And every animal has a number. It's all kept in a stud book. We know their genetic history. And basically the idea, the concept is to make sure that the most genetically dissimilar animals, so those that are least related, become the priority for reproduction and breeding. Now, there's a lot of other factors that have to be considered for making those pairings. You may have really good genetics to put together, but you may have some behavioral problems or too big of a size differential, whatever it may be. So it's a really fascinating day to sort of figure out which wolves are going to go where, and who's going to breed with who, and this and that. And what the captive breeding program also does, and this has been a really fascinating technique that the Fish and Wildlife Service has developed, is called pup fostering. So, for example, the last 3 years, we've been able to celebrate successful breeding of red wolves in the wild. We're on hiatus for that for a little bit. So we were finally able to get that back on track. And, when red wolves breed, they will essentially have, a litter. And, a red wolf mother can support, 4 to 6 pups. But if she only whelps 2, that means she's got space in her den to maybe host a couple other animals. So they'll take, and the cool thing about wolves is they all breed and they all whelp at the same time. So you'll have like a wolf from Oregon, or excuse me, Washington State. You'll get puppies, and you could translocate those out to North Carolina and put them in a den. And it's fascinating to me that there's been 100% success with pup fostering. No red wolf has refused accepting those animals into their den.
Really? That's really interesting.
And so what's fascinating, kind of getting back to the topic of inbreeding, is now you have genetically unique animals in a family group that enhance the genetic variability and diversity on the landscape. What the bigger concern is that, if you think about it, the original founders, the entire genetic knowledge of this species was in 14 individuals, right? So at some point, everybody's cousin. Okay, so
I was gonna say, because there's got to be some where's the top of the tree? I'm sure it's right.
So this is all statistics and math that fortunately I've escaped in my career. But basically, what they do is they look at these coefficients of the genetics within those founders, again, to ensure sort of dissimilar pairs are the ones that are prioritized. But there's what we call an inbreeding coefficient. So over time, you run these iterations of breeding and genetic mixing, you do see inbreeding increase. But a lot of that is based on being able to sustain a healthy reproducing population, because with each generation, you get another mix-up of genetic variability. So while the genetics in total are, they're not huge, that intermixing and reproduction allows inbreeding coefficient to be lower and more animals to be genetically unique and distinct and to proliferate and grow the population on the landscape. It's also interesting when you look at wolves and canines, a lot of them are pretty genetically similar, and I think that's kind of related to the dynamics of being in family groups. And you also have animals that aren't moving vast distances, whereas, for example, like the Florida panther, we got into a serious inbreeding issue, which is creating, kink tails and.
Yeah, I saw over in LA too. There's the mountain lions are having a big inbreeding issue over there because their habitats are so fragmented.
Exactly.
There's really no wildlife quarters, which the Florida panthers also suffer from not having quarters to be able to go
right.
Where there's
and
others.
That's a big thing. I'd love to chat with you about maybe in another episode is Florida panther. We do a lot of work on them as well. But the point I was getting at is that even with some increased levels of inbreeding, wolves tend to stay pretty healthy and strong. The bigger issue, or the one that became a bigger issue, is not inbreeding between closely related red wolves, but breeding with another closely related species, which is the coyote.
Coyotes? Yes, there we go.
For our next hour, let's talk coyotes.
Yeah.
So, as I explained earlier, as we sort of wholesale wiped out red wolves from the east, gray wolves from the west, you had this, and forgive me, because coyotes are one of my literal favorite species. If you ever had a chance to read Dan Flores's book, Coyote America, I highly recommend it, because they are such an emblem of human hubris. We've tried to, so speaking of an animal that has been much maligned and we've tried to wipe out and have failed miserably has been the coyote. Everything we've done to sort of knock that animal back has only made it persist and expand its range.
Interesting.
And unfortunately, the loss of wolves, which is the main competitor and sometimes predator of coyotes, wolves do not tolerate coyotes in their territory. This animal, which was kind of restricted to the Southwest United States and into Mexico, of course, began to expand dramatically. And in fact, fragmented, developed habitats were just a buffet line for coyotes. So they spread rapidly. Interestingly enough, coyotes also, the more you persecute them, they have what's called compensatory reproduction. So if you shoot and kill coyotes, coyotes respond by whelping more coyote pups. It's a dynamic where it's basically resources, right? So if there's a established, stable population of coyotes, they will just essentially replace themselves.
That's so interesting. I don't want to like quote I think it's a hip hop group called West Side Connection who said we don't die, we multiply.
Exactly.
But that's the coyote.
So I can see a coyote on that album cover because that's absolutely that's the lyric, man. And so it's fascinating ecology. But anyway, so coyotes made their way east, and so you had this issue again. One of the concerns scientists had in those early days of watching red wolves dwindle is as coyotes expanded, those two species began to interact. And what's fascinating is that red wolves and coyotes are very closely related. I want to make a point very clear, though, that pretty much all canines are closely related, and all canines are what we call admixtures of various, sort of dog soup, if you will. So a lot of times, when we talk about genetics, we have this sort of crude, simplistic idea of like, red wolf has to be pure, 100% red wolf. Well, that doesn't exist in nature. I mean, the classic example is Neanderthal genes, different species, still in my DNA. I did 23andMe. And I'm proud of it, right? Look at this eyebrow ridge. Anyway, my point is this idea of genetic purity is not really how nature works.
With the inbreeding, I'm kind of interested. Are you guys using in vitro?
So there is a lot of research going into everything from preserving sperm to doing in vitro. But the interesting thing is wolves take care of business pretty well. They're not like pandas.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I love a good panda, but let's be honest, they don't know how to take care of business always.
Yeah, they like too much foreplay.
Yeah, they're just busy with bamboo. They don't care. But wolves do a great job. I think the big limiting factor with successful breeding is generally behavioral, and we do have this issue, which we think is linked to again that reduced amount of genes out there. We do have some issues with I'm blanking on the disease, but basically it affects the uterus of female red wolves and prevents them from breeding successfully. But generally speaking, wolves that are a good behavioral match tend to take care of business and generally are very successful in the breeding. And again, that's something that is very closely monitored and managed by the SAFE program to make sure we're getting the right pairs, to make sure we're setting them up for the greatest success. And really, in the wild, the secret to success out there is just having enough animals to facilitate pairings and making breeding pairs. One of the challenges that we had when I mentioned that we kind of had a hiatus of wild litters was because we didn't have enough breeding females available. The only two females at one time were mother and daughter, right? So,
you're not gonna,
yeah. And so, but as we've again been able to start releasing more wolves in the wild from captivity, we're seeing breeding happen again. But I it's important for people to understand that wild animals, particularly wolves, lead really tough lives. For example, kind of a sad story, but this past year we had our third successful breeding event. We had, I think, a wild litter of 6 pups born. And unfortunately, those pups did not survive because the father, who generally, while the mother is nursing and whelping her pups, is responsible for bringing the food back, right? But as they're out hunting, he ended up getting hit by a car. And so was unable to provide for his family. So, the pups don't survive. So,
that's awful.
So you're talking about these numbers. You're talking about how dire it is. And yeah, like every individual matters is kind of the way we talk about it.
Well, it's such a tragedy of like an epic tragedy because not only, obviously look at the numbers and there's a death, but that death is like, what makes it so bad is that it's so pointless. Right. You know what I'm saying? Like there are some endangered species out in Africa and Asia, like the rhino, for example, where a lot of their horns get sold on the black market to like provide a wealth status for people and stuff, which is really shitty. But but sometimes those horns are like kind of the only mechanism for a economic stability for these really poor tribes out there, and then sold into Asia, sometimes even for medical use and obviously not at all, saying poaching is acceptable there, but if you track some of this, there is some good for these very poor tribes, but like in this case, like when it gets hit by a car, very like majestic unicorn like style species that is so endangered gets killed on the side of the road like trash, and then it just rots on the road there, because it got hit by some like 2008 Ford minivan, and it rots there, and then you see a whole litter. Right. A whole entire litter. And you think about these resources that were, created over the course of how long to produce that litter, ends up dying as well. And then you're back to back to square one. And, also too, like on the side of the road, I can imagine too, like forget about the red wolf dying on the side of the road. Say a deer or like a squirrel gets killed on the side of the road too. That then attracts the red wolf by the side of the road to then cross the road to try to eat it. And when you're eating, you're kind of relaxed. You have a meal in front of you, so you kind of lose focus, especially when you're a starving animal who maybe hasn't eaten in how long. So you kind of relax, and right by the side of the road, especially at night, you're just even more susceptible then to being hit again by a car too. So that's just and it really is so pointless because you're not even like utilizing the fur, nothing. Like that animal just dies so pointlessly, and that's such a tragedy.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's very tragic. One of the other, I think the thing that kind of broke my heart in losing these wild animals is not just the incredible, loss that literal loss that happened, but if we think about again these 45 plus facilities out there raising wolves, the folks that support these facilities that are benefactors, they have great affection for what these programs are doing, and they celebrate when these animals get put in the wild. And then, in a matter of months, they're like, oh, this animal I supported and sponsored and was able to see grow in captivity is now dead. People start to say, well, then why should we be putting these animals at risk, right? And that's a slippery slope. And that was kind of one of the more challenging dynamics I experienced. But a couple other points. I mean, one is to be able to do this work, you got to be tough. I mean, I have seen wildlife biologists shed tears over the work they do, and that just speaks to their commitment, but also their resolute and their toughness and their tenacity to get the work done. And I think the best antidote to misery and tragedy is to keep marching forward. And so I'm very excited to share. I think it's probably the first time I've shared it in this kind of forum, but we were able to work with our North Carolina Department of Transportation to apply for, under the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the wildlife crossings pilot program, to fund $25 million to install wildlife crossings on Highway 64, which is the main source of vehicle mortality. So hopefully in the next decade, we'll be able to have a corridor, a roadway that's permeable to wildlife that can pass safely to keep being wild. That's
awesome.
Yeah, so that was a big success. And I will say that in 2023 we settled our big lawsuit and got the program back on track. And then we got this huge amount of funds coming in for wildlife crossings. We've got this conflict transformation process we've been working on with local landowners. And so I think things are really looking up for red wolves, but we can't deny that they're still very much in danger. We can't deny there's a lot of work ahead of us, but I have been so humbled and so sort of just giddy with the amount of support this species has received.
Yeah, and for people kind of interested in a species that really is like bouncing back and forth between extinction, which is like, I mean, however long they've been on this earth, think about the intensity of that. I want to kind of bring up a couple of quick examples here of other species that like have teetered back and forth, but these in good ways here, where you got the blue iguana. I want to chat real quick, which it hit critically endangered in the Cayman Islands because of habitat loss in hunting. Similar to obviously the red wolf there losing a lot of its territory, and it only had 15 of them back in 2002. And then the blue iguana recovery program provided enormous support with captive breeding facility, which is like verbatim almost for like the red wolf. As I'm like talking about this, which fast forward to 2018, they released their 1,000th blue iguana into the wild, which is insane and awesome work on that. The giant pandas we were chatting about before, going from around a mere around 1,000 in the 1980s to now hitting around that a little notch above 2,000 range, thanks to China's efforts on restoring the bamboo forest and protecting the areas. But like in the case with the giant pandas, I really think it's more than that. I think it's kind of creating the culture of the giant pandas being like viewed as like these cute, cuddly bears that everyone loves and want to protect, which I think with the wolves, there's a lot of, obviously, like the first thing you think about wolf is like a negative connotation.
Yeah,
you got the Wolf of Wall Street, like you're thinking about these like this evilness behind them, and these like in a ultimate predatory status, which I think it might be true if you're a cow, you know what I'm saying? But like humans viewing them, I think can really go a long way, and actually maybe even further than just habitat protection, which is is putting a desire in the people to wanting to save and protect these animals like people do the giant panda. Because the giant panda today is like everyone's like best friend. Like a lot of children have little cuddly pandas that they have too. And what you see throughout the media is just like these cute little fat slobs sitting on their back eating the bamboo stick, like they're watching the football on Sunday. Which really goes a long way in terms of the longevity there. And then the sea otters maybe being the biggest comeback story ever, with a recorded population of around 2,000 back in the early 1900s, as they were hunted down for their fur back in the survival days there, and have rebounded a little bit over 100 years later to a whopping 100,000 worldwide. So that's one that really, you know, has kind of increased and maintained their habitat over the time, which is probably why their numbers have like absolutely exploded there. And now, you know, maybe one of the only ones to now not have that probably be completely off the list.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And those are all, you know, excellent examples. And I'm so glad you mentioned those, because I think when you're focused on crises, people forget the victories, people forget, you know, where we've succeeded, people forget that the formula has honestly been kind of similar. You know, protect the habitat, restore the numbers, protect the species. Boom. And then that very important part, dynamic of building cultural identity, empathy, value. I love that you bring up the panda, because it's, you know, it's a cultural icon. You know, in Florida,
it really is. It really is.
Yeah, like Florida manatees, a cultural icon. Like everybody loves a manatee. Everybody loves a panda.
What would it take? What would the number be for you guys to just slam the book shut on the Red Wolf Recovery Program if you reached it?
Yeah, great question. So again, the recovery plan goal calls for 3 self-sustaining populations across the historic range. And what that term of sustainability is based on is a pretty interesting scientific model called a population viability analysis, which is, or PVA for short. And what that model does is it looks at, you know, rates of reproduction. It looks at, you know, rates of death, both natural and anthropogenically caused. It looks at, you know, rates of inbreeding or hybridization. Basically, it takes all these factors into sort of what the population dynamic looks like for red wolves, and basically sets a threshold that says, okay, if we get below this point, we'll be extinct in 100 years. If we get above this point, the population will persist for at least 100 years. So that goal is to get to a number at a threshold with all these inputs in the model that basically we can say at this level, we can safely say that the chances of extinction are near zero for the next 100 years. So when we get there, that will be, I mean, the amount of champagne we're going to need. I hope I'm still alive. But the thing is, you know, we've got a long distance to travel to get to that point. But what's, I think, really exciting, again, we've done it before. We've had this successful model in North Carolina. We know we can make it work. The wolves do themselves all the justice of getting the job done, you know, reproducing, taking care of their families, you know, proliferating across the landscape. So I think, you know, it's really hard to put like a time horizon on there, but I know that, you know, anecdotally, Fish and Wildlife Service has a goal of the next 3 to 5 years of getting another population started. And part of that process is getting our safe facilities up to capacity to produce more wolves to sustain that output, right? So you can't take more away than you're making. So the idea is to get them out into the wild, doing their thing, and you know, subsidizing the population until it gets on its feet, and then letting it sing. Okay.
It's kind of like Hinge, right? It was like designed for you to delete the app, right?
Right, exactly.
Well, good stuff, Ben. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah.
Where people can find you, defenders.org. Where else would you suggest people kind of go out, search for you if they want to get involved?
Absolutely. Well, defenders.org is a great place to start. Of course, we're all over social media. So anywhere you know, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, maybe for a little bit longer, we'll see. And then I also want to encourage folks that are interested in either paying a visit to North Carolina or learning more about red wolves and the important work that's happening. redwolfcountry.com links directly to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's website about the recovery program, where you can keep tabs on the numbers. Also, the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, one of our amazing partners here in Red Wolf Country, they have a live webcam at the Red Wolf Center. So you can search that up as well and be able to tune in to see. And we're hopeful we might get some pups. We'll see how it works.
Okay. Well, sounds good, Ben. Thanks for coming on, and I'll see you down the road.
All right. Thanks so much. Good chatting with you.